Good afternoon, and welcome to Ask the Experts. I'm Samantha Pelham, a media relations specialist here at Ohio University, and your moderator for today's conversation. Today, I'm speaking with two of Ohio's history experts, Steve Miner, professor of history and expert on the Ukrainian and Russian crisis, and Josh Hill, associate professor of history and expert on China and political ideals, both in the College of Arts and Sciences. And today we're going to talk about global tensions that we're seeing around the world, especially in Ukraine and Russia, and how they impact the rest of the world. So welcome, and thank you both so much for taking time out of what I'm assuming is your very busy schedules to virtually sit down with me today and talk about something that's extremely important and a relevant topic, and something I know that a lot of people have questions, concerns about, and really just want to know more. But before we get started, I would like if each of you could introduce yourself and explain a little bit about your expertise in the field. Steve, how about we start with you?
Okay. My name's Steve Miner. I've been at Ohio University since the dawn of time, since 1986. And I'm a specialist in Russian and Soviet history. I teach the whole sweep of Russian history. But my specialty, my area of emphasis and research, is on the Stalin years in the Second World War, which is fortuitous because Mr. Putin makes many of his arguments based on the Second World War and its results. I also teach courses that bring Russian history up to the present and have been involved in writing on Russian politics, current Russian politics.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, we're very grateful to have your expertise in today's conversation. Josh, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks. My name is Josh Hill. I've been at OU since 2013. So my time here roughly coincides with the rule of Xi Jinping inside China. My area of expertise is Chinese history, specifically modern Chinese history, and my real interests are in sort of political ideas, Chinese conceptions of democracy, how systems have been built inside China to try and reflect both imported notions of democracy and also domestic notions of selection for merit and for excellence. And a lot of this sort of focus on ideology and ideas really ties in with the attitudes and visions of the contemporary government in Beijing on the crisis in Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, having your expertise added onto this conversation is going to really make it impact and give us some perspective too. We maybe not have heard as much recently. So thank you both again for joining us. It is much appreciated. For our viewers, if you have any questions throughout this live stream for our experts, please feel free to drop those questions in the comments section of the live stream, or feel free to direct message your questions to the Ohio University social media channels. We will do our absolute best to get to as many of your questions as possible today. But if we don't, do not worry. We can still answer your questions and send them to our experts after the stream so they can get some answers to you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with our conversation. Steve, if you can go ahead and kind of provide some context in history to, the conflict in Ukraine and Russia. When did it start, and kind of why did it start?
Okay, well, Mr. Putin has become a historian of late. He's written two 5,000-word articles. One was on Ukraine and the history of Ukrainian and Russian relations, and the other is called The Lessons of the Second World War, which was about the Second World War and its results in Europe. And finally, of course, when he declared a military emergency, I'm not sure what term he's using, but not war, his argument, which was developed at length, is a historical one. So he's been playing historian of late. And so for a historian, this is a treasure trove. Ukrainian-Russian relations, it's hard to say when they start. In fact, whether or not Ukraine and Russia were the same country at one time is a contested issue. Historians of Russia always start with what's called Kievan Rus back in the 10th century. But it wasn't a nation. It wasn't a modern state. That state, or whatever it was, the conglomeration of princedoms, was destroyed by a Mongol invasion in the 13th century. And since that time, what had been Kievan Rus, the Kievan part, which is now Ukraine, was hived off from Russia for 500 years almost. The Russians eventually brought it back into Russia and part of the Russian Empire. But then the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917 to be replaced by the USSR eventually, which forcibly kept Ukraine in the Union. Then when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine established its modern independence, which is sort of the starting point of the current quarrel. Mr. Putin's argument is that Ukraine never really has been a separate nation, that it was always separated by foreign powers, whether these powers were the Mongols or the Poles or the Swedes or the Germans or now NATO and the United States, that it owes its quasi-independent status purely to foreigners who have separated it from the Russian root in order to weaken Russia. And that what he's doing is reassembling what should be a fraternal country, a country that is one people divided by outside invasions. This is not good history, and no historian who's worth their salt would buy into any of it. It's nations don't have a sort of existence beyond place and time, and Ukraine and Russia have been separated enough so that they're quite different. And to sort of say, well, but the Tsarist state always had Ukraine, or Ukraine was always part of the Tsarist Empire. It's kind of like saying Austria really should own the Croatians because of the Habsburg Empire. This is something that has no force in the modern world. Clearly, Ukraine is a nation. It has a national sense of itself, and as we see, it's willing to defend itself. But Mr. Putin has different ideas. He subscribes to a Russian notion of a Ruski Mir, a Russian world. And that Russian world is a sphere of influence that Russia had at the end of the Second World War. And Mr. Putin feels it still should have, that you should have a glacis of states to the west of Russia that are either part of Russia itself or at least are dependent on it and not aligned with any outside power. And he extends this not just to Ukraine, but also to the Baltic states and to Poland and to Hungary. And part of his demands, which people frequently forget, is not just he wants to reincorporate Ukraine in a Russian world, but he also wants the countries of Eastern Europe to disarm, essentially, and to withdraw American nuclear weapons from the continent of Europe. So this is quite an extreme thing. What he's after here, in long term, is a reorientation of the balance of power in Europe. He's got quite big aims. His appetite, though, is not necessarily commensurate with his means.
Yeah, thank you. That is great information, and really nice to get perspective on kind of like the history of this and an idea of why he's going after Ukraine and clearly looking at maybe not just Ukraine for that power. So talking about other countries and looking at what is happening with Russia and Ukraine right now, Josh, can you talk a little bit about what the Chinese government's stance is on the Russia-Ukraine war?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think in some ways we can see a lot of perhaps high-level parallels with some of the things Steve just said about Russia. I mean, a lot of this comes down to arguments from history, arguments about history. And so we can see, I think we see a number of specific strategic issues in what Beijing is saying right now. But the broadest thing that I think is worthwhile to focus on, at least at first, is the insistence that Beijing has on non-interference with the sovereignty of other nations, which they say includes Ukraine, although this has to be, in the way that Chinese government spokespeople talk about it, this has to be correlated a little bit or softened a little bit by saying that there are special considerations at stake, there are special historical factors at stake in Ukraine. But broadly, the position of the Chinese government is that anything which tries to limit the sovereign authority of a state, that is outside interference inside a sovereign state, needs to be pushed back on. Now, that framework sounds like it could be applied in a number of different ways in this situation, but the precise way it's applied by the People's Republic of China, at least as of this moment, is that the initiator of this crisis is the United States through its attempts to expand NATO, that is the ultimate destabilizing force, that is the thing that has ripped apart security assurances in Eastern Europe. And so that therefore, this is something that will only be resolved when the United States and NATO allies move themselves out of the situation. And now this sounds like it's a very perhaps sort of philosophically grounded stance, but ultimately, and I think the reason why it has resonance in the party in Beijing and in the large segments of the Chinese public is that it's also grounded in Chinese history. For much of the last 150 years, but noticeably not the last 50 years, China was a relatively weak country subject to foreign invasion by the British, by the Russians, by the Japanese, by the Americans as well. And so that consciousness of being a state whose sovereignty has been violated, a state that's been invaded, a weaker state that was unable to deal with these invasions, still colors the perspective of many people in Beijing, even though China today in 2022 is one of the strongest nations in the world, doesn't suffer from security threats the way, say, the China of the 1920s and the 1930s or the China of the 1840s and the 1850s did. But nonetheless, that sort of historical way of thinking about the meaning of China's experience for the present day still echoes deeply in the halls of power in Beijing.
Great, thank you. And that's nice to kind of hear the history of China as well and how those two can correlate. We actually have our first question in from our live stream. And this is from Marnie May, and I believe this is directed more towards you, Steve. But Marnie is asking, do we see Putin stopping after Ukraine?
Well, that's a good question. I'm a historian, so historians write about the past. Maybe we can venture into the present. The future is sort of terra incognita. One thing I would, to play off of, I'll answer the question as I see it, but one thing I'd like to do is sort of play off what Josh was saying here. Wars are about disagreements, aren't they, ultimately? And there's a disagreement about NATO and the expansion of NATO. From the Russian perspective, and Putin has laid this out, and it's not just the Russian perspective, because remember, there is no Russian perspective. There's Mr. Putin's perspective, and there are all sorts of different Russian perspectives. It's by no means unified in this sense. But I'll speak about the Russian perspective as though it's Mr. Putin, just for convenience sake. He's argued that the Second World War was won primarily by the Soviet Union, that it paid the greatest price for the defeat of Nazi Germany, that it suffered this great attack that killed 27 million of its citizens, and that the result of this was a peace settlement that allowed the Soviet Union to ensure its security by dominating East and Central Europe. And that this was in some ways a thing that the Russians had paid a price for and had earned. And that what they've seen since the end of the Cold War is not only national humiliation for having lost the Cold War, but also the encroachment on their territory that they see as vital for their defense. And they see the expansion of NATO further to the east as evidence of this. And in fact, Mr. Putin has said this is like the dawn of the Second World War, when people ignored Hitler's danger and allowed him to arm and then to approach the Soviet Union so closely that he could ultimately launch an attack. Okay, so that's his point of view, or at least the point of view that he argues. But there is a second point of view. And that point of view is those countries have a right to security too. Russia is not the only country in the world with security interests. The countries of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, these countries were dominated by the Soviet Union and were brutalized by the Soviet Union. In the case of the Ukrainians, the collectivization of the farms in 1932 to 1933 starved to death 3 to 4 million people. This is something that formed the modern notion of Ukrainian nationalism and of national separatism. The Russian notion of security is that all of its Western neighbors must be insecure and trust to its goodwill. The Ukrainian answer to that would be, look who Mr. Putin is invading. He's invading the country that is not under the NATO umbrella. This is not an argument, they say, for not expanding NATO. It's for not having expanded it fast enough. And that's what the fight is about. And you have Americans say we shouldn't have pushed Putin to the wall. Okay, fine. Should we have trusted him instead? Look what kind of government he has at home, where he's shutting down the press, he's shutting down civic institutions, he's arresting 6,000 people because of their demonstrations. He's slapped a 20-year penalty on people who demonstrate, and he's punishing people who slander the history of Russia and of the Soviet Union. A 14-year sentence for slandering soldiers of the Second World War. Do you trust this sort of state and say, well, if we don't provoke him, he'll leave us alone? Did the Ukraine really provoke him? Is it really run by Nazis and drug addicts, as he said? or is that a fantasy that he's using in order to advance other goals? And what I would say is I've laid out his argument, and that is the argument he makes. There are other considerations that the Russians have, and they're considerations about regime security in Russia, not national security, but regime security. And there you have Putin, who's afraid of his own people. His formative influence, his formative life experience was the collapse of the USSR and its Eastern Empire in 1989 to 1991. He doesn't want to see that happen again. He's also seen so-called color revolutions in places like Ukraine and other places. He's afraid of popular sovereignty and popular will. The worst thing in the world for him would be a successful Ukraine that was free, democratic, prosperous, and integrated with Western Europe, because it has a huge border with Russia that is crossed by people of both ethnicities. He cannot stand the idea of Ukraine being prosperous and free and on his doorstep. And in that sense, I wouldn't liken it to Taiwan, which is always done in the press, but rather to Hong Kong, which posed no security threat really to China. It posed an ideological and political threat, and that's what happened with Ukraine. It's the NATO stuff is smoke and mirrors. Now, to answer the person's question, will he go farther? Well, he's an extremist. Many of us didn't think he'd attack Ukraine, did we? We kept, he's going to blackmail them, or maybe he only wants the eastern portions. Surely he won't take the whole of Ukraine. Well, read his statement of declaration of war. The declaration of war does extend to the eastern flank of NATO, to the Baltic states, to Poland, to Romania, to Slovakia, to Hungary, and to Moldova and Romania. I guess I said Romania twice. And to the removal of American nuclear weapons from Europe. He said these things are unnegotiable points. They are his red line. Do we believe him? He said it. I don't know. I think the performance of the Russian army, in Ukraine doesn't make him look like a fearsome enemy for a conventional war against NATO. But he has nuclear weapons, and he has the largest collection of nuclear weapons in the world. So I don't know what he's going to do next. I do know that what he's doing right now is wicked beyond belief, and is the greatest challenge to world security, and certainly to European security, since the Second World War.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Josh, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure, just trying to think a little bit about, again, about Beijing's interest in all of this. Mm-hmm. If we move away from ideological to thinking about practical and strategic, over the last decade and a half, the People's Republic of China and Russia have moved closer to each other. They have natural interests together in some ways, at least at this current moment in time. The PRC is able to provide funding for Russian institutions that have been sanctioned in previous rounds of sanctioning by the West. The PRC is able to provide manufactured goods for Russia. Russia, in turn, is able to provide raw natural materials to the People's Republic of China, specifically natural gas and oil. These are things that the PRC lacks. It's a net importer of. And previously, the imports into China of those raw materials came through the South China Seas, through sea lanes that are potentially open to be controlled by foreign navies, whether the US Navy, the Indian Navy. And so to have access to these materials through Russia in a way that can't be interdicted by foreign militaries is a real sort of benefit from the perspective of Beijing. That, I think, is what's brought them close enough together that earlier this year, in the beginning of February, they made a joint announcement pledging friendship without limit, to quote from the document directly. Whether or not that meant that Xi Jinping realized that a full-on invasion of Ukraine was about to come is a subject that is open to debate right now. There's been articles in the American press recently that indicates that either he knew or he had some foreknowledge. There was an allegation printed in the New York Times yesterday or the day before that Xi Jinping had asked the Russian government to postpone its invasion of the Ukraine until after the end of the Winter Olympics in Beijing. These are sort of new allegations and are rejected by the Chinese government. The foreign ministry spokesperson yesterday called them fake news, so we can take them for what they're worth. The other thing that is sort of weighs on the other side of this is that while the relationship between China and Russia is really important from Beijing's perspective for material reasons, perhaps for ideological reasons as well, it pales in comparison with the importance of Beijing's relationship with other countries. The cross-border trade between the PRC and Russia in 2020 was about $100 billion, which is twice as much as it was a decade ago. Cross-border trade between the US and the PRC in 2021 was $700+ billion. Cross-border trade between the People's Republic of China and the European Union that year was over $800 billion. So the relationships between China and its other trading partners are far more important in terms of aggregate value. And so the strategic question facing the leadership in Beijing, given that this war in Ukraine has turned out to be very large and it's giving every indication that it's going to go on for a long amount of time and it's generated an enormous reaction in the rest of the world, is how are they going to balance out some benefits they get out of the relationship with Russia with the potential costs to China's ties with other parts of the world? As of right now, there's no good answer from Beijing. And I think that's one of the things that accounts for the real harshness of the rhetoric you hear out of the PRC government right now, that it's a sort of a form of distraction of saying, don't look behind the curtain at the fact that we have not yet figured out how to balance all of this out.
Right. Thank you so much. And actually going off of that, we have a question from Michelle who asks, is it possible for Russia and China to form an alliance at all? And if so, what does that mean for the rest of the world?
Josh, take it first.
Sure. So historically, they have formed an alliance. There was an alliance between the People's Republic of China right after it was founded in 1949 and the Soviet Union. For a while, it was a very tight alliance, basically for most of the 1950s. It involved an enormous exchange of economic goods between the two countries. The Soviet Union really participated in rebuilding a devastated China after World War II. So you see all sorts of enormous Soviet impact, even on China today, in terms of urban architecture, the organization of institutions of higher education, some of the early legal systems adopted in the PRC in the 1950s, all were Soviet imports, Soviet factories, Soviet styles of economic planning and management, plus several tens of thousands of Soviet advisors moved to China in the 1950s as well. This was an alliance that for American Cold War planners in the 1950s seemed really frightening, made even more frightening by the fact that in 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea, the People's Republic of China joined the war, and so soldiers of the Chinese military, I guess technically volunteers in the service of the Chinese military, engaged in direct combat with American soldiers from November 1950 down to the signing of the armistice in 1953. It seemed like a new organization of world power that would really push the United States out of the Eurasian continent. Much of American foreign policy in the 1950s and the 1960s revolved around trying to think about how to deal with this. I mean, it's one of the reasons why, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why there was a U.S. intervention in Vietnam. It was fears of Chinese power in alliance with Soviet power. The alliance between those two countries fell apart quite dramatically in 1960. I mean, it wasn't necessarily recognized outside of Moscow and Beijing for several years after that, but there was a severe personality conflict between the leaders of both countries. The Soviet advisors who were living in the PRC were sent back home. By 1968 and 1969, there was a border war fought between Russia and China. I mean, it seemed like this relationship that was once so solid really broke apart. And that's a model that I think is something that everyone would need to pay attention to for the future, that there are strategic issues that in the abstract can bring Beijing and Moscow together, but there's also enormous opportunities for differences between the two countries. I've been thinking about this specifically from long-term habits of thinking about Chinese history. One of the enduring issues in Chinese history for 2,000 plus years has been defense of China's northern border. I mean, I don't think I can count how many times a dynasty in Chinese history was overthrown by intervention from the north. And so given that history and given the vulnerability of that border and given the strategic orientation of not just the current leaders of Beijing, but any sort of imaginable future leaders of China towards weakness on that border, it's hard to see how you could have a long-term, sort of multi-decade alliance that will work out. In the short term, however, which is where we all live, it's absolutely possible that some sort of agreement can be reached and will have immense effects in the world over the next 5 years, 10 years.
I agree with that, but I would add a few things from the Russian perspective. The Russians are in possession of a sixth of the world's surface, and it's only 144 million people, which is only slightly larger than Japan. China, of course, is what, 1.3 billion, I believe, is the number that's usually used. Much more heavily populated. I've traveled on the Trans-Siberian. The cultural shock going from Russian-controlled Siberia, which is empty, to Asia teeming with people is something I'll never forget. You don't forget it if you see it. China has a voracious, it has a very, very vibrant economy and a voracious appetite for raw materials. And there sits Siberia to the north, empty of people and resource rich. The Russians are worried about that. They have been worried about that for a long time. Josh didn't mention, but they have a border dispute that stretches back at least to the 17th century in the Pacific East. And they came very close to having a nuclear exchange in 1969. According to Kissinger, the Russians approached the Americans and said, "Would you mind terribly if we were to nuke Beijing?" And the Americans said, "Well, yes, because the fallout will kill Japan." And that this was the basis for the famous rapprochement between Nixon and Mao, the threat of Russia. So they have interests, but those interests are more fleeting than the structural disputes. But they're there, as you say. We live in the short term, right? And both states chafe under two things. One is the domination of the dollar and the American economic system. That's one thing. They neither one of them like that because it means that their reserves are denominated in dollars, and that's a problem for Russia right now. It has a rainy day chest of $630 billion. But it's in dollars. They can only get access to about 17% of that. And this crazy war that Mr. Putin has launched is costing them $20 billion a day. So being denominated in dollars is a problem for them. They'd like to shift out of that. The second thing is neither one of them like American alliance structures, NATO in the West and the so-called Quad in the East, both of which are designed, frankly, to contain these two countries. They know it, we know it, and it causes friction. And so that's brought Russia and China together, but there are so many other things that divide them. And I think they put their bet maybe on the wrong horse, because I don't think they expected Mr. Putin to be quite as reckless as he's been. And they've really put pressure on China. China now has to decide if they are going to open up their banks and fund the Russians. They've decided so far not to do so. Why? Because if they do, then they are subject to these swift sanctions as well, because so much of their wealth is denominated in dollars and shifted about with dollars. If they start fooling around with the Russians for a measly $100 billion a year, they could end up costing themselves a couple $1 trillion a year. So you can bet on the wrong horse too. And they both may have a desire to see a change in the economic and security structure of Europe. But the Chinese aren't as reckless as Mr. Putin seems to be.
Yeah, the Chinese have benefited from the existing world order for the last 40 years. And that's something that Xi Jinping must know personally. His daughter was educated inside the United States. Many people in the PRC leadership now have family abroad, have traveled abroad, have relationships abroad, have been enriched by foreign trade. So there's a lot to lose.
Yeah.
The other thing that I would point to in terms of just thinking about China's northern border for a moment, this current iteration of China's northern border is the result of unequal treaties signed with the Russian Empire in the late 19th century. So Vladivostok, that entire part of what's now the Russian Pacific coast, was Chinese territory until the 1860. That was the final one of those treaties. This is territory that's not currently disputed between the two sides. They came to an agreement about their border disputes. It was a series of slow agreements, and the final one was finished in 2008. But if you go to high school in China, you were educated about the unequal treaties. You were shown maps of what China looked like when it was governed under the last dynasty and the pieces that have been taken away ever since. And it's something that is not currently on the policy agenda, but you could easily see how it would get there. It's something that as nationalism is stoked inside China, you could see how this is an issue that could be brought up.
Mr. Putin made a point the other day about how historically borders are very fluid and they change all the time. What he meant was, of course, the USSR collapsing, and he'd like to see part of the Russian Empire restored. He should be really careful how he says that, because if you apply that logic to the East, Russia is in occupation of territory that a much more populous and much richer and much more powerful state covets. And I think it's really quite silly of him. I think the best verdict on Putin's misadventure was delivered, strangely enough, by the Kenyan ambassador to the UN. He said at the first meeting of the UN after the invasion, he said, if anybody has a right to complain about imperial powers drawing borders carelessly and with no regard for the inhabitants, it's certainly Africa. And yet we've agreed amongst ourselves that it's best to live with these borders than it is to fight to change them. And that if you do this, if you start to fight to right all the historical wrongs of that plague you, you open up a can of worms that you have no idea where it's going to end. Mm-hmm. There are certainly claims against Russia. Russia likes to see itself as a victim. It also occupies a sixth of the world's surface. It didn't get that way by constantly being victimized. It took other people's territory as well. And if you're going to start redrawing borders, this won't be done to the benefit of Russia all the time.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to say we are getting a slew of questions in from social media as well for the both of you. So I'm going to go ahead and get in as many as I can. Our first one asks, Putin recently made some points about Afghanistan. Do you think after the U.S. withdrawal, he's thinking about going after Afghanistan now?
No.
Short answer. No.
There's no evidence of that at all.
Okay.
The Russians got their fingers burned in Afghanistan. There's nothing really to be gained by doing that. The Chinese are interested in Afghanistan because it's got significant quantities of lithium and rare earth minerals and various other things, which are useful to modern chip making and various things. So they're interested in that, but in a commercial fashion. I don't see the Chinese sending in forces, and I don't see the Russians doing that either. No, I really don't. There's no evidence of it. Now, I could be surprised, right?
Yeah. Josh, do you want to add to that, or Steve got it covered pretty well?
No, I think that covers basically all of it. The only thing I would add is that there is a land border between Afghanistan and the People's Republic of China. It's not a very large one, but there is one there. And so events in Afghanistan are something that Beijing pays attention to and is concerned about. I mean, more broadly, Central Asia and the stability of Central Asia is something that Beijing has invested a lot of time and energy in and trying to think about. They organized a treaty organization based in Shanghai to deal with this, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So in terms of thinking about direct things like the sending troops overseas or whatnot, I think that's probably maybe looking too far in the future. But in terms of thinking about the stuff that really concerns the leadership in Beijing, absolutely, they're very worried about instability in Central Asia. One of the lessons that the People's Republic of China learned from the collapse of the Soviet Union, there are several things that get talked about, but one of the lessons that was learned in the PRC and that is openly discussed inside the party, there's in fact a documentary series made about this about a decade ago inside China that was apparently mandatory viewing for party officials, is that the Soviet Union's failure to control its periphery, failure to control minority groups, failure to keep them inside Moscow's orbit was one of the things that led to the entire system falling apart. And I think that inside Beijing right now, there's a determination to make sure that doesn't happen to China. And that explains policies in Tibet, that explains policies in Xinjiang, that explains policies in Mongolia, Inner Mongolia.
And I would add, too, that these countries in Central Asia are quasi-independent, but there's a competition, friendly so far, between Beijing and Moscow as to who wields the most influence. And it's resource rich. Kazakhstan has a lot of oil, as does the Caspian Basin. And both Russia's an exporter of oil, But China, as I said, has this voracious appetite for oil, and that's a flashpoint as well.
Great, thank you. So our next question is followed by a little bit of context too at the beginning. So one viewer asked, Putin has stated that the goals of Russia's operation in Ukraine are its demilitarization and neutral status, with some sort of puppet government installed in Kiev. Or as he has said, Russia won't stop until it achieves total victory. But as you said, his appetite may be larger than his means to achieve those goals. What do you think he's willing to accept short of those goals? Is there some kind of bare minimum threshold? Or like Stalin, is complete control of Ukraine non-negotiable for him?
It's a good question, as was the previous one. I didn't mean to laugh about Afghanistan. The reason I laughed is because the Russians are wary of going into Afghanistan. No, this is a very good question, and nobody can answer it entirely because we don't know what lies in Mr. Putin's head. However, there were several off-ramps that he could have taken if he did not seek to control all of Ukraine. He could have annexed, or at least occupied, Donetsk and Luhansk, the areas in the east of Ukraine that are predominantly Russian. He could have said, I'm going to take Ukraine, but only up to the Dnieper River. He has restated just yesterday that his intention is to occupy all of Ukraine, that all of Ukraine has to be rid of, as he says it, Nazis. You have to get rid of, denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. The first claim, denazify, is almost literally insane. The president of Ukraine is himself Jewish and hardly a Nazi, and his grandfather was a decorated war veteran of the Second World War against the Germans. There are rightists and radical rightists in Ukraine, and some of them are kind of scary people, as I believe there are in the United States, and as I'm sure there are in Russia. They got no seats in the Rada. They got no seats in the Rada. There are more right-wing nationalists in the German parliament than there are in the Ukrainian parliament. And Mr. Zelensky got over 70% of the vote. And on a non-nationalist ticket, nationalism in Russia, in Ukraine, would be exclusive of Jews. Instead, his party and his program are inclusive of the minorities as well as of Ukrainian people of Ukrainian background. So what will Putin stop at? It appears he does want to impose his puppet government. And as I say, he's reiterated this just yesterday. I don't think that he can stop having cast the dice so forcibly. It would be such a loss of prestige that he could well be overthrown if he had to back down. There's a logic that pushes a dictator forward. What I'm very afraid of, and I think we're going to see, is as the Ukrainians resist, and I'm not talking about conventional resistance because the Ukrainian army is not going to be able to fight forever. But if people don't surrender in Kiev or in Lviv or in Kharkiv, Putin has used weapons of mass destruction before on cities. He flattened Grozny in the late 90s, flattened the city, and he's using what you call thermobaric weapons already, allegedly, in Ukraine. And these are things that have the power almost of a small nuclear device. And you could see him destroy block by block a city like Ukraine, like Kiev, which would be an immense tragedy. Kiev's an ancient city. It's a beautiful city. The Nazis savaged it, but it was rebuilt lovingly. And you're going to see mass civilian casualties. And at that point, the cry to do something in the West is going to increase. And the chances of some kind of conflict are going to increase.
Thank you. Josh, did you have anything to add to that?
The longer the war in Ukraine goes on, the more difficult Beijing's strategic calculus gets, which is a little bit not of direct evidence, but perhaps indirect evidence that this war in its current form was a surprise to the leadership in Beijing. The longer it goes on and the more sanctions that are imposed on Russia, the tighter that the NATO alliance becomes, the more Asian countries. We saw sanctions announced by Japan recently, by South Korea as well, Singapore even. The more that Asian countries become tied even deeper into an American-led alliance system, the worse off Beijing's position in the world becomes. How bad does it have to get to change the thinking inside Beijing is an open question. And perhaps nobody outside of Xi Jinping and his innermost circle, if even them, really know.
Thank you both. Like I said, we've got all the questions flooding in, so I'm just going to keep going with them. Our next one is, could either or both of you expand on how U.S. policies and leadership, but not NATO, have played a role in this war?
We're neither one of us experts in American policy. I do pretend to be a U.S. Soviet sort of specialist a bit. How have they contributed to it, or how have they affected things since the invasion? I guess there are two things. The lead up war thing.
How policies and leadership have played a role in this war?
Okay. I think Mr. Putin moved when he did, in part because he thinks the Chinese have his back. He signed this agreement with them, and that sort of secured his eastern frontier. And he could move west without fearing that he was going to get hit from the Chinese or the Chinese joining a coalition against him. Why did he move right now? Then this does enter into American politics. The Russian perception of the United States was that it is fundamentally socially disorganized and inept. They look at the United States and they see riots in the streets last summer. They see the January 6th mess. They see gridlock in Congress. They see a country that can't even write up a budget, much less keep within one. They see stresses in the Western alliance, where Germans view Russians or they did up until now, viewed Russians more favorably than Americans, and where many NATO allies bridled at paying a heavy price to be members of NATO. They saw a president who questioned the need of NATO, and they saw us leave Afghanistan after losing fewer people in 20 years than the Russians have already lost in 7 days of fighting in Ukraine. And they perceive this as weakness. Mr. Putin is a bully, and a bully respects force. You see this, by the way, in very strange ways. He knew, for example, that Angela Merkel, who was the German chancellor, was afraid of dogs. So when he would meet her, he'd bring in his enormous great dog, just simply to intimidate her. He plays that kind of a game. This man is a bully all the way down. And I think people like that see weakness, and they sniff weakness in the air and think they can move. He also has seen Americans reluctant to use force in the wake of our involvement in the Middle East, and thinks they won't stand up to him. Now, okay, so that's beforehand. I think he's been quite surprised by the reaction of the Western powers, that they have actually pulled together. And what he's done, he's magically achieved the very things that he said he was against. NATO has pulled together. It has come up with the most crippling sanctions ever in its history. It has increased its defense spending. It has integrated the eastern flank more so than it was before. Poland and Hungary, which were sort of bridling against cooperation with the EU, have now fallen into line. Countries that are as pacifist as you can imagine, and certainly neutral as you can imagine, Sweden and Finland, are now talking openly about joining NATO. He has created the very monster that he claimed he was going to go in search of and slay in Ukraine. This has been an enormous miscalculation. And you have a ruble that now, the ruble's worth less than a penny. It has collapsed. The Russian stock market has not even been open for 5 days because they're afraid that it'll simply collapse. Nobody's trading Russian shares on the the British Stock Exchange or on the New York Stock Exchange. This is a disaster, economically, a disaster militarily. He tried several strikes early on in this war by special forces. They got their heads handed to them. They have the second largest air force in the world, and they don't have air superiority over Ukraine. The Russian army has been shown to be not only wicked in invading its neighbor, but also extraordinarily inept. Does that answer your question?
Hopefully it answers our viewers. If not, it's still a lot of great information. And actually, we got another question in from social media that I think to an extent kind of relates to this. Someone's asking, what threshold do you think would have to be crossed for the United States to become more actively involved, whether that's by airstrikes, boots on the ground, or advisors?
Well, they've held pretty close to that line. NATO. there are a lot of people writing and saying we should, send A-10s over this column that's stranded in Ukraine and strafe it. It is a tempting target to any air power. The Americans have said no, and NATO has said no. And the people who talk like this, people who always throw about military stuff, are people who know nothing about the military. Where are these airstrikes going to be based? Are we going to send aircraft carriers into the Black Sea where they would be sitting ducks? Are we going to send them into the Baltic? Or are we going to fly American aircraft from NATO bases where the hosts will not allow us to land if we carry out airstrikes? In order to have any kind of airstrikes or air cover over Ukraine, NATO is an alliance where you have to get all 30 members to agree to it. That's not likely to change. The weakest link is going to say, no, I don't want to risk nuclear war. And I think it's also the prudent call, by the way. I'm not saying that, I wish we could. I think that the idea of Americans and Russians directly killing one another hasn't happened since the Korean War. You talked about the Chinese. There are also Russian pilots that flew in the Korean War. And we shot down a lot of them, and they shot down a lot of our guys. But since then, we've been very careful not to do that because you could find yourself in a nuclear exchange. And I know I sympathize with the Ukrainians. My heart goes out to them. I wish we could help them. It would not help them if the world was engaged in a nuclear war.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. And, I guess kind of going off of that, can you talk a little bit about why Putin would, is threatening nuclear war and what that could mean for the rest of the world?
Well, he's such a loose cannon that it's hard to know. There's been all sorts of things brooded about his health and maybe that he's changed mentally. Nobody knows any of those things. But the checks on his action are very, very few. The difference between Putin and the old Soviet Union was an oligarchy. Yes, Brezhnev was the first among equals. But if a general secretary, after Stalin anyway, if a general secretary got too far out of line, his comrades could depose him, as they did with Khrushchev, and as they did, later on with Gorbachev. There was a check, in other words. They didn't have this sort of personalized dictatorship. Putin had that at first, a sort of oligarchy. It's now become an autocracy where he's not checked by anyone as far as we know. And so you have to ask, does this one man have a death wish? He's talked blithely about nuclear war. However, there was one ray of hope today. He came out and said, he made a speech, which was an extraordinary speech. After he says, I'm going to take all Ukraine and nobody can back us down. He said, we should regularize our relations with our Western friends. And we shouldn't have things like interruption of trade and this sort of thing. So he held out this olive branch that to the Western powers, as though, don't look at what's going on in Ukraine. We can still collaborate normally. It's a bizarre thing to say, but it also shows that he's getting hurt by those sanctions, doesn't it? But it also shows a little rationality, a glimmer of rationality, that maybe the guy really does want to survive and that he's not just going to simply throw nukes around. Now, why does he threaten it? Because threatening it is good politics, isn't it? He is trying to scare the West from getting too involved in Ukraine. And it works, because if he didn't have nuclear weapons, we would have American airplanes over Ukraine with a no-fly zone. It's the nuclear weapons that's stopping it.
Yeah.
Alas.
It's fascinating to hear your viewpoint on that, though, because I know, myself and I've heard people concerned about what is the possibility of nuclear war. And, is this just a kind of dangling tool to stop us from coming over and helping with Ukraine and doing what you said? Or is it, something we should seriously be concerned about?
It's something we should be concerned about. They're tossing around the talk about nuclear war in a way that no responsible power should do, and the way the Russians have not done since the time of Stalin. It is irresponsible to do this. The more you talk loosely about nuclear weapons, the more inclined you might be to use them, and they ought not to be talking like that. But what can we do?
Yeah. Another question we have come in. Thank you, by the way, Steve. This one I believe, both of you can answer, but Josh might be a little more directed towards you. Is the person saying, I just saw a headline in the Washington Post the last hour saying that the people of Taiwan worry that they are next in terms of invasion by a neighboring large power, in parentheses China, under the pretense of reunification. What do you think about that possible scenario?
So that's a great question. There's a few ways to think about it. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry has been asked that question, actually asked multiple times at recent press conferences, and each time they reject that there's any connection between these two things. In particular, the PRC emphasizes that Taiwan is not a sovereign nation. It's not recognized by most other countries in the world as a sovereign nation. That there is, again, to use the PRC's rhetoric, that there is an uncompleted task of national reunification that needs to take place at some point in time in the future. But then to move on a little bit from that, that there's no manifestly clear timetable for when that's going to happen. Obviously, the spectacle of a larger country invading a smaller neighbor has, and a non-democratic country invading a democracy has awakened a lot of interest in the Taiwan issue again. Certainly, we know that the Taiwanese government is concerned about it. Not only did they join the sanctions against Russia pretty quickly and pretty early on, but they also commissioned a study team to try and figure out what they can learn for Taiwan's defense from the fighting that's going on in the Ukraine right now. So it's a good thing to be on people's radar screens and to be thinking about it. You know, in the very near future, there is no evidence of a Chinese military move against Taiwan, at least nothing that is publicly available. And that's reassuring because any Chinese move, any People's Republic of China move against Taiwan would be something that's very visible. Taiwan is an island off of the coast of Fujian province. It's about 110 miles away from the mainland. It would require an enormous amphibious operation. I mean, think sort of like D-Day type stuff. In order for a war to be fought, it would be something that we would have advanced knowledge of. Beyond the fact that we don't have any evidence of something like that going on, this year is a pretty critical year in Chinese political history, or at least in the Chinese political calendar. There's a party congress, which happens once every 5 years, scheduled for this fall. The exact date hasn't been set yet, but October, November, something like that is typically when they are. That's a big deal because the party congress is where the direction for the next 5 years is set. So it's a big deal in general. It's specifically a big deal because practice for previous 20 or so years has been that general secretaries of the Communist Party, who concurrently also serve as presidents of the People's Republic of China and also chairman of the Chinese Military Commission, serve 2 5-year terms and then step down. That got changed over the last few years. And 4 years ago, the party constitution and the national constitution were both changed to allow for additional terms in office. So almost certainly we're going to see Xi Jinping, who's finishing his 10th year right now, being reappointed for an unprecedented third 5-year term. Even though we're pretty sure that's going to happen, it hasn't happened yet. It's obviously a sensitive thing. And the idea that she would look for a foreign policy adventure that, as we see in Ukraine, could go very wrong or move in very unexpected ways in the run-up to something so sensitive is hard to buy. So I think in the short term, that's all positive news. In the long term, you know, Taiwan has a very unique history. It was part of the Qing dynasty, the last empire, the last imperial dynasty to rule China, seized by Japan as a colony in 1895, governed by the Japanese Empire down to 1945. Returned to the rule of the mainland, but not the communists, the Nationalist Party, which was the government of China and America's World War II ally, returned to the Republic of China in 1945. But then when Chiang Kai-shek and his Nationalist Party lost their civil war, they fled to this island of Taiwan in 1949, an island they had only governed for 4 years. It was governed as a police state by exiled mainlanders affiliated with the National Party, a nationalist party, all the way down to the 1980s when, as a result of people power and domestic unrest and protests in the streets and the work of really brave democratic activists, the island democratized.
Excuse me.
And so that dynamic of a place where it's tied to the mainland through this shared history, Chiang Kai-shek's government, when it fled to Taiwan, always claimed on its own to be the sole legitimate government of all of China. That's a claim not emphasized by the current government in China, but it can't also be abandoned either, because abandoning that claim and saying that we're not the Republic of China, we're the Republic of Taiwan or something else would be a declaration of independence, which would invite war. So we have this very ambiguous situation where we have an island that's, a Chinese culture that has democratized, that has been profoundly successful in the 21st century world in a lot of really admirable ways, but as an accident of history doesn't possess internationally recognized sovereignty. So the potential for disputes, misunderstandings, I think is there and will continue to be there for decades.
One thing I would say about the military, one thing that that the dispute or the fighting in Ukraine has shown is just how complicated modern warfare really is. There are a lot of moving parts, and you have to coordinate air, ground, special forces, intelligence, artillery, infantry, armor. You have to have logistics and all this sort of stuff. The Straits of Taiwan are some of the roughest seas in the world, and they're 100 miles, whereas our D-Day, which was a fairly close-run thing for a while, crossing into Normandy, the channel at its narrowest point is 20 miles wide. So this is a very formidable thing, and neither the Russians nor the Chinese have a recent history of operational combat, and they have, and the ones they were involved in were not particularly successful. You think of Vietnam, for example, their brief war with Vietnam.
China's war in Vietnam in 1979,
It's a mess. Now, both countries have spent a lot of money on upgrading hardware, but hardware is hardware. Experience comes only with experience, and neither one of them have that. And I think this has been a sobering wake-up call to people in Beijing who say, hey, we got a Navy. Well, China, I'm not a Chinese specialist, Josh, but when was the last time China had a big Navy that it really actually used?
1894, the war with Japan, and it ended up on the floor of the Yellow Sea.
That's right. But when was the last time they had a big naval success?
A military success?
Yeah.
On the high seas? I mean, yeah. on the Yangtze River and things like that, I can definitely think of some from ancient Chinese history. On the high seas, I mean, you can look at things like the early Ming dynasty. So what, the late 14th century, early 15th century, so-called treasure ship expeditions of Zheng He, the eunuch admiral.
I know. You're making my point, Josh.
Those weren't.
It's like Portugal saying we're a major seafaring power because of Vasco da Gama.
Those weren't military expeditions. I mean, there were soldiers on them, and they were ships that could engage in combat, but they were not even voyages of exploration either. They were voyages that in the the late 14th century, then new Ming dynasty used to demonstrate its success and prestige to sort of overawe people in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean basin. But sort of long-term outwards projection of Chinese naval force, I mean, if we see that in the 21st century, it will be a very new thing.
Well, of all the complex elements of modern warfare, the most complex is naval warfare, particularly naval aircraft. They have no experience of this, and they have a lot of hardware. But I think they're looking at Ukraine perhaps and saying, maybe we don't want to cast the dice.
Great. Yeah, I was going to say we've still got tons of questions, but I know we're getting close to time. So I'm actually going to ask one last question. And for any questions that we did not get to, we can either get those questions to both of you and have you respond to those who've asked them, or if the both of you are okay with it, we can have our viewers reach out to you directly with any questions that they have, if you'd be willing to talk with them about it. So our last question here, I'm going to kind of try to put two of the ones we've got into one, but they're asking, is there a way out of this conflict that would allow Russia to, quote unquote, save face to some degree? And, once this is over, is there a way to hold Putin accountable for what he's already and currently doing to Ukraine?
Well, to answer the second part first, there are moves afoot to have him indicted as a war criminal. Now, of course, you have to get him, right? And that's not going to be easy. But this has been done with other leaders, and should they fall from power, then they're fair game. As for the first, is there an exit ramp for Putin? There can be if he wants one, but he seems to be a fellow that sees any backing down as being unacceptable. And I don't think we're there yet. Sure, there are ways you could say we only want Crimea and Eastern Ukraine and a pledge of neutrality and not joining NATO. I don't think those are terms that the Ukrainians themselves would accept right now. It's like saying, okay, you're imposing terms on a defeated enemy? And you're compromising our sovereignty. If anything, I think he's right now got the Ukrainians' backs up. So right now, I don't see the basis for some kind of off-ramp. I mean, there might be in the future, but right now, I don't see it. There's going to be some fighting for a while.
Yeah. In terms of thinking about China's role in all of this, there's a lot of discussion in sort of American academic watchers of China, the American sort of think tank community and whatnot, about what concrete measures could the U.S. government take to try and widen the gap between Beijing and Moscow to maybe not pry apart the relationship, because perhaps that's not possible, but make clear to Beijing that there are going to be real costs to this. I'm not sure I've seen anything that is particularly persuasive about how to operationalize that idea. But there are lots of ties that exist between the United States and the People's Republic of China, even now that we're 4 or 5 years into a much more competitive relationship. There are still lots of person-to-person ties. There's still lots of ties that exist between individuals and the governments of the two countries. And if anyone were asking me for my own advice, for my own 2 cents, it would be that, the Chinese government is not going to profit from a world situation that gets ever more unstable. And one of the reasons why this event has attracted so much interest over the last week or so is that the Ukraine-Russia crisis war really has led to unprecedented changes in how countries interact with each other, in terms of how the NATO alliance is talking to one another. You see the changes, and we've talked about much of this already. New German investments in their military. You hear new rhetoric, specifically out of the government in Tokyo, in Japan. The longer this goes on, the greater the odds are that the new world situation that comes out of it is not going to be as favorable to Beijing as is the current one. And so that might be a good sign that Beijing should try and apply whatever leverage it has to bring an end to this. How successful that would be, I don't know. Can we leverage those personal ties across the two countries to really affect the thinking that Xi Jinping and the people around him have? I don't know. We know a lot about Putin, or at least we think we do. We don't know as much about Xi Jinping and what makes him tick. There have been attempts to figure that out, but I think we really are left with a lot of guesswork about what we can do to influence his thinking about the world.
Great. Well, thank you both so incredibly much for this conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I know we could continue on for probably another hour, if possible. But like I said before, for our viewers, if any of your questions did not get answered, we can be sure to try to get those answered, or you can also reach out to both Josh Hill and Steve Miner to, any questions you have and to converse with them about the situations that's currently going on. I also want to thank our 2 interpreters, Clayton Waits and Kyle Hill, who have been wonderful on this live stream as well. And I want to thank you and show my appreciation for the 2 of you. Thank you again so much for this conversation. Everyone I feel like is, in the news every day, seeing what the latest updates are. And my heart just goes out to Ukraine, and in hopes that the people can, flee and stay as protected as possible. So thank you again for this conversation, and for all of our viewers for watching this. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Is that us done then? Good job, Josh. Good job, Samantha.